The last thing anyone expects when pulling into their own driveway is to find a swarm of HOA board members standing in the gravel with clipboards, cell phones pressed to their ears, and one man shouting into his radio like he's directing an FBI raid. But that's exactly what I saw as I turned off the county road and eased my truck into the driveway that evening. I didn't even have the door open before one of them, Howard, the smug HOA treasurer, strode forward with his shiny loafers sinking in the gravel and barked, "We need $20,000 now, or we're calling the police to cuff your wife." I actually laughed out loud because it was so absurd, but the way his eyes darted between the others told me this wasn't a bluff. Before I could even reply, Howard raised his hand toward the woman standing near the mailbox, and she instantly dialed her phone. 5 minutes, or they take her in, he repeated, looking almost thrilled by his own words. I had moved here for peace, for wide skies and quiet nights. But since buying this place, an old farmhouse, 10 acres that had been in foreclosure, the HOA had been sniffing around like vultures. Angry that I'd bought it at auction and not through their approved realtors, they had pulled every dirty trick in the book. From fake violation letters to urgent inspection notices, but this was a new low. I told Howard to calm down and that the cops weren't going to cuff anyone over whatever nonsense he was cooking up, but that's when 2 patrol cars rounded the corner. Lights on, but sirens off, moving slowly like they were trying not to alert the whole neighborhood. My wife, Claire, stepped out of the house holding a glass of water, confusion on her face as she saw the flashing lights. She had only been in this town for 3 weeks, and most of that time had been spent settling into our new life while juggling her actual job in law enforcement. I could see Howard's smirk growing with every second, as if he believed his little plan was about to deliver him the ultimate HOA victory. What he didn't know, and what I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing about, was that earlier that same morning, Claire had been sworn in as the new police chief of the entire county, a role she'd been quietly offered after months of being vetted without the HOA ever catching wind of it. She hadn't told them, hadn't announced it to anyone except close family, because she liked the idea of keeping her personal and professional worlds separate until now. The 2 officers who stepped out of the first car were young, clearly tense, and their eyes darted between Howard and me, as if they weren't sure who was actually in charge here. Howard puffed his chest and pointed toward Claire, declaring, "There's your suspect failure to pay HOA fees and property violation fines, 20 grand outstanding. Cuff her and impound the property until we get payment." The taller officer blinked, hesitated, and then glanced at Claire with a flicker of recognition. But Howard was too busy pulling a crumpled folder from his leather satchel to notice. The second officer took a slow step forward, clearly uneasy, while the HOA crowd murmured in anticipation. I decided to let the charade play out just a little longer, partly because I wanted to see Howard dig his own grave, and partly because Claire had that subtle smile she gets when she's about to completely dismantle someone's nonsense. She sipped her water, handed me the glass, and took 2 steps toward the officers with her badge now visible at her waist. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice calm, but carrying that unmistakable authority that comes from years on the force. "Why don't you tell me exactly what you've been called out here for?" One officer stammered, explaining that they'd received a call about an active warrant for her arrest, but they hadn't confirmed it yet. Claire nodded slowly, pulled out her phone, and pressed a button that immediately put her on a secure line with dispatch. "This is Chief Dalton," she said clearly. "Run my name and confirm any warrants." The reaction on the officers' faces was instant. They froze, eyes wide, while Howard and the HOA members looked at each other in complete confusion. I could see the gears turning in their heads, but before they could catch up, dispatch confirmed over the radio that there were no warrants and that Claire Dalton was indeed the newly sworn-in police chief. Claire turned back to the group, her tone still polite but now laced with steel. "I suggest you all think very carefully about the next words out of your mouths," she said. Howard's face turned the color of a ripe tomato, and the rest of the board looked like they'd been caught stealing cookies from a jar. The young officers exchanged glances, clearly realizing they'd been pulled into some HOA power play, and now the tables had completely turned. I couldn't help but step forward and grin. "So, About that 5 minutes, I said, looking right at Howard. The man actually stepped back, muttering something about misunderstandings, but Claire wasn't done. She signaled to the officers, and one of them quietly began taking statements, while she calmly explained to the HOA members that filing false police reports, especially ones that involve fabricated warrants and extortion demands, carry serious criminal penalties.
Oh.
The crowd was silent now, except for Howard's occasional grumble.
Ow.
This was just the beginning, and I had a feeling that the HOA had no idea how much trouble they'd just brought on themselves. And trust me, are going to want to hear exactly how Claire dismantled every single one of them in the days that followed. So stick around, because this is where things go from bad to catastrophic for the HOA. The moment the officers shifted their stance, placing hands on their belts like they were ready to act, the tension in the air thickened. I could see Karen's smug expression from across the driveway, her thin lips curling into a self-satisfied smirk, as if she'd already won. My wife, Sarah, still in her civilian clothes but radiating an unmistakable authority, didn't move a muscle. The HOA board members stood behind Karen like vultures ready to pick at a carcass, some whispering, and some outright snickering. "She's not even a real cop," Karen declared loudly, glancing at the officers as if she expected them to share in the joke. The two patrol officers exchanged a look, clearly confused by the situation, but before they could ask another question, Karen stepped forward, brandishing a crumpled sheet of paper like it was a court order. "The HOA demands payment," she announced, waving it in the air. $20,000, 5 minutes to pay, or she's getting cuffed right here. The audacity in her tone was staggering. But what was worse was how she genuinely believed she had the authority to dictate police action. Sarah remained calm, her hands folded in front of her. But I noticed the glint in her eyes, the one that always told me she was silently counting down before she acted. "So you're ordering the police to arrest me?" she asked Karen, her voice smooth, but with a razor edge hidden beneath it. Karen scoffed. "That's exactly what's happening. There are local police, and they have to listen to the HOA." The officers' brows furrowed. One of them, a younger man with sandy hair, seemed like he wanted to speak up, but Karen's voice bulldozed over him. "Go on, cuff her. HOA policy says non-payment leads to removal by force." The absurdity of it all would have been funny. If it weren't so dangerous, the older officer finally stepped forward. "Ma'am, HOA policy doesn't override state or federal law," he said, his tone hesitant but firm. Karen turned on him instantly. "Do you want to keep your job? Then you'll follow instructions." She had no idea she was barking orders at people who had already begun questioning her legitimacy. Sarah's patience was running thin. She reached slowly into her bag, not to pull out her wallet, but to retrieve the heavy dark blue leather folder that contained her badge. Karen's eyes narrowed, but before she could accuse Sarah of making a move, Sarah flipped it open with a practiced motion, holding it up so everyone could see the golden emblem and the engraved words, "Chief of Police." The shift in the atmosphere was instant. The officers stiffened, eyes snapping to the badge with immediate recognition. "Chief," the older one said, his voice a mixture of surprise and disbelief. "That's right," Sarah replied, her tone cutting through the tension like a blade. "Chief Sarah Lawson, recently sworn in as the head of this department. And now I'm ordering you to stand down until I've assessed this situation." Karen's smirk faltered for the first time. "You're lying," she snapped, but her voice lacked its earlier force. "There's no way someone like you could." "Could what?" Sarah interrupted sharply, stepping toward her. "Be more qualified than you thought? Outrank every single officer in this county? Or maybe you just didn't think I had the power to turn your little stunt into a criminal investigation?" Karen's eyes darted toward the other board members, seeking backup, but their expressions were quickly shifting from smug confidence to unease. The younger officer, clearly eager to avoid crossing a superior, addressed Sarah with newfound respect. "Chief, what are your orders?" That single word "chief" seemed to echo across the driveway, shredding the illusion Karen had tried so hard to maintain. Sarah's gaze swept over the officers, then to the gathered HOA members. "First, I want a full statement from every person here. Second, I want to see any and all documentation authorizing this so-called fine. Karen tried to speak, but Sarah cut her off with a raised hand. And if I find that this was an attempt to coerce payment under false pretenses, I'll be making arrests myself. The murmurs among the board members grew louder, but no one dared to move. The officers began jotting notes while Karen's composure cracked further. "This is harassment," she shouted, but her voice no longer carried the same conviction. "You're the one harassing residents," Sarah replied coldly. "And unless you want to explain yourself in front of a judge, I suggest you start cooperating." My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I stepped away to glance at the screen. Was a text from a friend at the county clerk's office. "You weren't kidding. There's been a huge mess with your HOA's leadership, lots of forged signatures in their last election." I slipped the phone back in my pocket, suddenly aware that we might have just stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple extortion. Attempt. Sarah caught my eye, and I knew she'd read the same thought in my expression. Karen was still trying to bluster her way out, insisting that the HOA bylaws gave them supreme authority. But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. She was studying Karen like a hunter sizing up prey. The younger officer approached Sarah quietly. "Chief, should we call in additional units?" She nodded. "Yes, and I want them to bring the HOA's public records. This doesn't end today until we've pulled apart every part of this scam." The mention of the word scam made Karen freeze for a fraction of a second, just enough for Sarah to notice. It was a small crack in her armor, but it was all Sarah needed. Within minutes, 2 more patrol cars arrived, their lights flashing in the fading afternoon sun. Neighbors had begun to gather at the edges of their yards, whispering and filming on their phones. Karen's voice grew more desperate, but every word she spoke only made her sound guiltier. "This is a private matter. You can't involve the whole department," she shrieked as Sarah turned her attention to the new arrivals. "This is now a criminal matter," Sarah corrected, her voice calm but unyielding, "and I'll see it handled as such." The HOA board members shifted nervously, some trying to edge away from Karen, others clearly calculating whether it was worth staying loyal to her. The older officer returned from his patrol car holding a clipboard of documents the HOA had provided earlier. "Chief, you'll want to see this," he said, handing it to Sarah. She scanned the pages quickly, and I could see her jaw tighten. "These signatures are identical," she said flatly. "All of them. Forged." Karen's protests grew louder, but they were drowned out by the unmistakable sound of handcuffs clicking open. Sarah looked at the officers, detained her for questioning. "We'll get the rest of the statements at the station." Karen's face went pale as the officers stepped forward. "Can't arrest me. I'm the HOA president," she screamed, but her words fell on deaf ears. The gathered crowd watched. As the once arrogant figure was led toward the patrol car, her voice growing fainter with each step. Sarah turned back to the rest of the board members. "Anyone else have something they'd like to admit before we go through your records?" Silence. The driveway was still except for the scratching of pens on paper as the officers finished taking statements. In that moment, I realized just how quickly the tables had turned, and that we were only at the beginning of uncovering whatever Karen had been hiding. The tension inside the community hall was suffocating, like the walls themselves were leaning in, trying to crush the air out of everyone. The HOA board members sat there with smug expressions plastered across their faces, leaning back in their chairs as if they were conducting the trial of the century, while my wife, in her calm, composed manner, sat at the center table with her badge just barely visible under her jacket. Nobody from the HOA had yet realized what that badge meant, and they were about to walk into a storm they couldn't even begin to imagine. The so-called president, Carl Thompson, leaned forward with that oily smirk and tapped a manila folder. On the desk, "You've got 5 minutes left," he said mockingly, "before I make the call to have you cuffed and taken downtown. Unless, of course, you've got 20 grand in cash sitting in that purse of yours." My wife didn't even blink. "And what would be the legal basis for that?" she asked, her voice level but carrying that edge that made even me shift uncomfortably. In my seat, Carl laughed, looking at the other board members as if they were in on some inside joke. "You're in violation of HOA covenants, and you're a threat to the neighborhood's property value. We have the right to detain you until payment is made." The ridiculousness of it made me want to laugh, but the sight of the 2 men standing at the door, clearly not real police, but wearing enough gear to fool someone at a distance wiped the humor out of the moment. "Gentlemen," Carl said. "To them, prepare to place her under arrest in 4 minutes." My wife slowly reached into her jacket, and I saw Carl's smug grin falter just a fraction when she pulled out her ID wallet and opened it to display the gold shield of the chief of police. The room went silent. One of the so-called enforcers at the door shifted uneasily, glancing at the other, who now looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. "Carl," my wife said in a low, precise tone, "do you have any idea? What happens to someone who impersonates an officer, unlawfully detains a citizen, and attempts to extort money in the presence of a sworn law enforcement official?" Carl's jaw worked as if he was trying to form words but had suddenly forgotten how to speak. The other board members were looking at each other now, confusion mixing with fear as the reality began to sink in. "You can't," Carl started, but my wife cut him off, her voice sharp enough to slice through the room. "I can, and I will. You have about 30 seconds to explain yourself before this entire place is treated as a crime scene." That did it. The fake cops at the door stepped back, raising their hands slightly as if to distance themselves from the mess. "We were just told one started," but my wife raised her hand to silence him. "Save it for your lawyer." Her eyes were locked on Carl now. For the first time since we'd moved into this HOA-run neighborhood, he didn't look like the man in control. He looked like prey. I could see his hands trembling just slightly as he fumbled to close the folder in front of him, his bravado evaporating under the weight of the badge on the table. One of the other board members, a woman with tightly pulled hair and a trembling voice, tried to speak up. "This is just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," my wife interrupted, leaning forward. "You gave my husband and me 5 minutes to hand over $20,000, or you'd have me cuffed. That's not a misunderstanding, that's extortion." She glanced over at me and gave a small nod, and I knew what it meant: play along, because this was about to escalate in ways the HOA hadn't prepared for. "Carl," she said again, her voice now slow and deliberate, "how many other residents? Have you done this too?" He looked at the floor, avoiding her eyes. "I asked you a question." Silence, and then, almost too quietly to hear, more than a few. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. "You're finished," my wife said, simply pulling out her phone. "As of this moment, this meeting is over. Everyone here is to remain seated until backup arrives. If anyone moves for the door, they'll be charged with obstruction." She hit speed dial, and within seconds, I could hear the distant but unmistakable wail of sirens growing louder. Carl's face drained of color. The rest of the board looked like statues carved from pure panic, and those 2 fake cops were now practically glued to the wall, eyes darting to the exits but too scared to make a move. My wife leaned back, crossing her arms as she waited, and I realized the game had shifted entirely. This wasn't about the HOA's petty power anymore. This was about holding every single one of them accountable, and she was just getting started. As the tense standoff unfolded outside the HOA headquarters, the wind whipped through the narrow street, carrying the sound of muffled shouting and the occasional static-laced crackle of police radios. My wife, Police Chief Emily Carter, stood, with her hands resting casually on her duty belt, her badge gleaming under the flickering streetlights. The HOA members, who had tried to extort us earlier, were now huddled inside, peeking out from behind the blinds like frightened raccoons, their earlier arrogance melting into visible unease. Just hours ago, they had been demanding $20,000 from Emily, thinking she was just another citizen they could intimidate. But now they were face to face with a police chief who had legal authority and a battalion of officers at her disposal. Emily kept her voice calm but firm as she directed her officers to lock down the perimeter. "Nobody leaves, nobody enters unless I say so," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. I watched with a strange mix of pride and grim satisfaction, knowing that these people had no idea how much trouble they were in. Inside the building, I could see HOA President Robert Lang pacing back and forth, his phone glued to his ear, likely calling his attorney, though I doubted any legal help could undo the mess they'd created. The extortion attempt had been caught on multiple body cams, plus a security camera across the street that had recorded everything from the moment their so-called enforcement officer gave the order to cuff Emily if she didn't pay. The irony was almost too much to take. They had practically written their own arrest warrant. As Emily gave a subtle hand signal, 2 officers approached the door and knocked with the kind of force that made the blinds shudder. A voice inside yelled, "We're in a meeting." But Emily simply said, "Meeting's over." Moments later, the door swung open to reveal Robert himself, his face pale and sweat beading along his temple. "Chief Carter, this is a misunderstanding," he began, his voice trembling slightly. Emily stepped forward, her presence filling the doorway. "A misunderstanding? You ordered your people to have me handcuffed unless I paid you $20,000. That's not a misunderstanding, that's felony extortion." Robert's lips moved, but no sound came out. She motioned for the officers to enter, and within seconds, they were reading rights to half a dozen HOA board members who had been involved in the scheme. Some tried to protest, claiming they were just following orders, but Emily cut them off. "You're not in the military, and this isn't wartime, you're civilians committing crimes. That excuse doesn't work here." I could see the shock settling over them, their confident smirks replaced by the wide-eyed realization that they had just lost everything. Out, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered, whispering to each other about what was happening. Word had spread quickly, and people were pulling out their phones to record as the once untouchable HOA leaders were escorted to waiting police SUVs. Emily didn't rush the process. She made sure every arrest was done by the book, knowing these people would try to find any loophole to slip through. The evidence, however, was airtight, not just the recordings, but also the text messages and emails my wife's team had obtained via a lawful warrant earlier that evening. They revealed months of coordinated harassment, targeted fines, and warranted fines, and threats toward multiple homeowners, not just us. As the last of them were placed in the back of the patrol cars, Robert tried one last time to appeal to Emily. "Chief, can't we just settle this? Drop the charges and we'll make it right." She didn't even look at him when she responded. Making it right would have been not committing the crime in the first place. I stepped closer and met Robert's gaze, letting him see the satisfaction in my eyes. "You wanted to teach us a lesson? Consider it learned, but not by us." The SUVs pulled away, their flashing lights casting red and blue reflections across the quiet street. I thought it was over, but Emily knew better. "This is just the start," she said softly, almost to herself. She explained that while the arrests were significant, the deeper issue was the HOA's financial dealings. Based on what they'd already uncovered, there were signs of embezzlement, fraud, and even potential racketeering. The district attorney's office was already reviewing the evidence, and Emily was coordinating with state investigators to dig into the HOA's books. For years, the association had acted like its own little government, operating above the law. But now, the tables had turned. Back at home, we sat at the kitchen table with coffee, replaying the events of the night. It was surreal to think that less than 24 hours earlier, Emily had been targeted as a supposed victim, and now she had dismantled the very organization that tried to extort her. I asked her if she felt any satisfaction. She gave a small smile. Satisfaction? Maybe, but I'm more concerned with making sure this never happens to anyone else. That was Emily, always looking at the bigger picture. Even so, I could see the weight lifting off her shoulders. She had fought back not just as my wife, but as the chief of police, and she had done it with integrity and precision. Just before bed, she received a call from one of her lieutenants. They had found a safe in the HOA's main office, and inside was a treasure trove of documents, ledgers, contracts, even envelopes stuffed with cash. "Looks like Robert and his crew had more secrets than we thought," the lieutenant said. Emily thanked him and told him to secure everything for evidence. I couldn't help but grin. It was becoming clear that this so-called homeowners association was about to face consequences far beyond a single night's arrests. And knowing Emily, she wasn't going to stop until every last piece of their corrupt empire was dismantled. The storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. And this time, they were the ones trapped in it. When the HOA's threats reached a fever pitch and the town seemed to buzz with whispered rumors about our supposed crimes, Melissa and I decided it was time to quietly set our next moves in motion, keeping even our closest allies in the dark. For maximum impact, because the truth was, The HOA was no longer just throwing accusations. They were now openly trying to sabotage her authority as police chief, planting false stories in the local newspaper, and even attempting to sway members of the city council to push for her removal under the guise of conflict of interest. But what they didn't know was that we were already collecting a mountain of evidence linking them to a years-long pattern of extortion, falsified citations, and even witness intimidation, all of which Melissa had carefully cataloged in a secure case file that couldn't be tampered with. And while they thought they were cornering us into submission, we were methodically tightening the noose. The first real opening came when a councilman, who had always been a silent supporter of the HOA, suddenly approached Melissa in private and revealed that the HOA president, Janet, had offered him a sizable bribe to vote for a motion that would effectively strip the police department of authority over HOA property disputes, something that was both illegal and a clear overreach of their power. And when he handed over an audio recording of the conversation, it was like striking gold, giving us not just leverage but a smoking gun. And yet we knew we couldn't act prematurely, because the HOA had deep connections in the county, and a botched move could give them a chance to bury the evidence. So instead, Melissa played it cool in public, smiling during community events, chatting pleasantly with Janet whenever they crossed paths, all while feeding her just enough harmless information to make her think she was winning. But behind the scenes, she had assigned 2 trusted detectives to quietly surveil key HOA meetings and track financial transactions that were showing suspicious patterns of cash withdrawals, followed by large purchases in the names of relatives of board members. The deeper we dug, the more sinister it became, with links emerging to a shady contractor who had been receiving inflated payments for maintenance work that didn't exist. And as Melissa connected the dots, it became clear that this contractor was funneling kickbacks to several board members, Janet included, through a web of shell accounts, which made my blood boil, because this was happening in plain sight. While they tried to frame us as criminals for standing up to them, we decided the best way forward was to bait them into making a mistake so big they couldn't wriggle out of it. So I drafted a letter, supposedly from an anonymous whistleblower, claiming to have insider knowledge about an upcoming police department audit that would expose friendly deals between the HOA and city officials, and we slipped it into the HOA's office mailbox late one night. Sure enough, within days, Janet began panicking. Calling emergency board meetings and making frantic phone calls, we were able to intercept thanks to a warrant. Melissa secured under the guise of investigating a separate harassment complaint. And what we heard was priceless. Janet instructing other board members to shred documents, delete emails, and even consider moving certain funds to offshore accounts until things blew over. And with every word she spoke, she was digging her own grave. Melissa remained outwardly composed, but I could see the fire in her eyes as she began prepping for the takedown. And part of me couldn't believe how far this had escalated from a simple demand for $20,000 on the day we moved into a full-blown federal-level corruption case. One particularly tense evening, as Melissa reviewed the growing evidence, she looked at me and said, "Once we move on this, there's no going back. They're going to come at us with everything they have left." And I simply nodded because I knew she was right, and that was fine with me because I was done being reactive. It was time to hit them where it hurt. So the plan became to coordinate a simultaneous arrest of the key players during their next big community fundraiser, an event they had been hyping for weeks, and which we had reason to believe was actually going to be used as a cover for laundering another large sum. The night before, Melissa's team rehearsed the operation with military precision, assuring that when the moment came, there would be no room for error. But still, I couldn't shake the thought that these people, arrogant as they were, might have one last desperate card to play. And sure enough, as the fundraiser began and Melissa's officers moved in, we spotted Janet slipping toward the side exit, phone pressed to her ear, muttering something about getting the lawyer on standby. But she didn't make it 3 steps outside before she was surrounded and cuffed, her expression a mixture of rage and disbelief. And as they loaded her into the squad car, I realized we had just crossed the point of no return, the HOA's. Rain was crumbling, but the war wasn't over yet, because Janet had allies in higher places, and we both knew the counterattack would be coming sooner rather than later. The morning after the chaotic night, the town felt eerily quiet. It's like the air itself was waiting for the next move, and as I poured my coffee, the bitter taste did nothing to dull the awareness that we were still in the middle of a high-stakes standoff with the HOA board and their enablers. The very same ones who thought threatening to cuff my wife for $20,000 in 5 minutes was a reasonable demand. No, they were scrambling because their power was slipping away fast. Claire was in her office at the station by 8 a.m., not because she had to, but because she knew the other side wouldn't rest until they tried one last desperate act. And as chief, she had to be 2 steps ahead. I watched from the ranch window as unmarked cars kept idling near our gate, likely scouts or intimidation tactics, but I refused to show them an ounce of fear. I took the truck into town to meet Hank, our local sheriff's deputy who had been quietly helping us since this began. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from knowing your badge is being dragged into the mud by false reports and politically motivated garbage. "We're close," he said in a low voice, glancing over his shoulder as if anyone could be listening. "State investigators have everything they need, but they're waiting for the right moment to move, so nobody slips away." That was the only thing keeping me from demanding an immediate arrest. The HOA, or at least their current leadership, wasn't just corrupt, they were reckless, dangerous, and deeply arrogant. By noon, I was back at the ranch, where Claire had pulled up with 2 marked cruisers, not for intimidation, but because she was implementing her new department policy. No HOA-related police response without direct confirmation from her office. It was her first official strike at dismantling the HOA's control over law enforcement resources. The timing couldn't have been better, because just as she signed off on the memo, our neighbor, Mrs. Carlisle, called in a panic to say that the HOA security team, those same uniformed rent-a-cops, who pretended to be law enforcement, were camped out at the entrance to our street, stopping vehicles and questioning drivers. Claire's jaw tightened. "That's a legal detainment." "Let's go," she said, grabbing her radio and heading back to her cruiser. I followed in my truck, and what we found at the end of the road was exactly the kind of power trip nonsense we'd expected. 2 men in dark uniforms with HOA patches standing in the middle of the lane, clipboard in one hand, radio in the other, stopping a delivery driver who looked both confused and nervous. Claire stepped out, her presence radiating authority, and said, "Step away from the vehicle and put your hands where I can see them." They tried to smirk it off, but when they saw the marked cruiser and recognized her face from the swearing-in ceremony that had gone public, their posturing faded. "This is a private community," one of them started, but Claire cut him off sharply. "This is a public road, and you're committing an arrestable offense by blocking it. Move now." And they hesitated. Hank, who had followed behind us, without saying a word, stepped forward and read them their rights. It was a small victory, but it sent shockwaves, because within an hour, the HOA president, Gregory Holt, had called me personally, his voice dripping with fury. "You think you can embarrass us like this? You're going to regret this, Mark?" I almost laughed. "The only thing I regret is not doing it sooner, Greg. You've played bully for too long." He hung up without another word, which told me he was rattled. That evening, as the sun dipped low, casting that golden light across the ranch, I stood on the porch thinking about how quickly life had changed. A week ago, we were just moving into our dream property. Now, my wife was the police chief. I was knee-deep in a battle with the HOA, and the state was circling them like sharks. But I also knew Holt wasn't finished, and neither were the ones who backed him financially. If anything, they doubled down. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. TikTok. I showed it to Claire, and instead of fear, she smiled. Faintly. Good. That means they know the clock is running out for them, not us. The night was quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet that comes before the last big storm. As the dust of the confrontation settled, the HOA's so-called leaders sat cuffed in the very folding chairs they had dragged out to the roadside. Their once smug faces now pale and blank as the reality of their actions caught up with them. The official police cruisers, summoned by my wife's own officers, lined the street like a fleet of judgment, each one a symbol of the authority that the HOA had so arrogantly underestimated. Neighbors gathered quietly along their driveways, whispering to one another. their glances shifting between the arrested board members and my wife, now in full uniform, radiating a calm authority that made it clear she was not someone to cross. The $20,000 ransom demand that had been the centerpiece of their bullying tactic had now become the very nail in the coffin of their legitimacy. With every second of the exchange recorded on body cams, dash cams, and even a few phones from bold bystanders, officers read the charges aloud: extortion, conspiracy, false imprisonment, each word slicing through the last remnants of the HOA's fabricated power. My wife's gaze never wavered as she directed her officers to process them one by one, her voice steady but edged with the kind of steel only a seasoned leader carries. As the HOA president was led to the cruiser, she caught my wife's eye and muttered something about making a mistake. To which my wife replied in a voice just loud enough for the crowd to hear, "The mistake was thinking you could intimidate people into paying for your corruption." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the neighborhood. The following days, the story spread across the county, then the state, carried by local news and social media clips that painted the HOA as a cautionary tale of arrogance meeting justice. Our phones were flooded with messages from people we'd never met, thanking us for standing up, for not folding under pressure, for showing that some lines can't be crossed without consequence. The property values the HOA had once claimed they were protecting plummeted, and with their leadership removed, the association dissolved under the weight of lawsuits and investigations. Standing on our porch a week later, the evening air cool and still, I looked at my wife and saw the quiet pride in her eyes, the satisfaction of knowing that her new role as police chief was more than just a title. It was a responsibility she'd upheld with honor. She took my hand and said, "They thought they could scare us into giving them what they wanted. Now they've given us something instead: peace." And as the sun dipped behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of gold, I knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, not only for us, but for every neighbor who had been afraid to speak up. If you think HOA power grabs like this need to be exposed and justice needs a louder voice, subscribe to Sham Stories, because the next time someone like them tries to pull a stunt, you'll want to see exactly how it ends.